Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux, and today I've got some rapid fire tips for you guys to improve your macro photography at home. Now I'm going to leave it until after the intro for you guys to guess what today's subject is going to be. I'll see you in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux, and if you hadn't guessed already, today we're just going to be shooting some simple peppercorns. So it's a really easy subject that you guys can follow along with at home. Head off to the kitchen, grab some peppercorns or any similar small subject, and we can work through from start to finish on improving our macro photography. Now I'm going to jump straight into this one and grab my camera, so go and grab yours and we'll get started. So first things first, your camera and your lens. Does it matter what you're going to be using for macro photography? Well, yes and no. There is limits to what a normal camera can do. When we're talking about macro photography, we need to get really close up. So it really helps to have a macro lens. Now, not all macro lenses are equal, just the same as not all cameras are equal. So in answer to questions like, can we do this on a mobile phone? Absolutely yes. You just need a phone that is capable of zooming really far in, or perhaps using a clip-on macro lens, or if you've got one of the brand new fancy iPhones, those have a macro lens built into their cameras as well. Now I am going to be using a proper camera. This is a mirrorless camera, but you can use a DSLR. The important thing for macro is the lens. So the lens is going to determine how close up you can get to your subject and what kind of magnification you're going to get. This is a 100mm f2.8 Tachina lens. That gives me a pretty good magnification, about 1:1 scale, meaning that when I take my picture, my peppercorns will be an accurate size when it's projected onto the sensor. I'm also going to be using a cheaper alternative that gets a lot more magnification. This is a reverse lens setup using an old second-hand prime lens and some extension tubes. Now, we don't have time to explain fully how this thing works, but I will link up in the top right-hand corner of your screen to a video that's dedicated just talking about how this setup works. It's a really cheap alternative to get a lot of magnification and get nice and close to your subject. So I've got two little glasses of peppercorns ready to go, and I'm just going to quite literally spill them out onto my table so that I've got something to take a look at with my macro lenses. I've got a couple of different types of peppercorns here, and I can't stress this enough that it really doesn't matter what your subject is. It can be something as mundane as some food from the fridge or some seasoning like this. Anything up close is going to look much more interesting with a lot of magnification. So the first thing I'm doing is just taking a look through the lens at what my peppercorns look like down on my table. So as you're probably aware from looking at that initial footage, things are a lot more interesting up close with this custom setup with my extension tubes and reverse lens. However, there's a few things that we really need to improve to get some better shots here. Notably, we need better settings, we need better lighting, and we need some stability. Now, the first thing, the easiest thing to work on is getting a bit of stability. When you're working up close with a lot of magnification like this, holding your camera steady is pretty impossible. Every tiny little movement, even if you've got the steadiest hands in the world, is going to create a lot of movement. If you're doing video like you've just seen, that makes it very juddery and hard to watch. But if you're taking stills, you're going to need a really fast shutter speed to cut out any camera shake that you might create with the movement of your hands. The easiest way to improve all of these things really quickly is to use a tripod. I do recommend, if you've got the time setting up at home, to set up on a tripod and try and keep things steady. So now that I've got my camera set up on a tripod, you can see that we're nice and steady. There's not a lot of camera shake there unless I start moving my camera around or moving the table. We'll get a little bit of wobble. But a couple of things here that do really help with your tripod. One is a ball head just here so that you can point your camera wherever you want. It just gives you a little bit of extra freedom to compose your shots. Next is this, which is a macro focusing rail. We'll talk a bit more about this in a little while. It's handy, but not absolutely necessary. The last thing that I do want to talk about is this little gadget over here. This is a shutter release cable, so you can plug this into your camera and then not have to touch your camera at all. This becomes your shutter button and you can press to take your photographs without wobbling your camera and adding that camera shake. Now that I've stabilized my setup with a tripod and a shutter release cable, I can start to think about my composition, settings, and lighting. These are all really easy things that we can start to experiment with once we've got a nice stable setup. First of all, we're going to take a look at improving our settings and our lighting. This is killing two birds with one stone because more light usually means better settings. A lot of beginners find adding artificial light to their images to be quite daunting. It can really complicate things and muddy the waters with your settings, but it's not as hard as you might think. It can really help to evolve your macro photography from being quite bland, single light sources and natural light sources like the sun or a window. They can tend to create the same results over and over again. Adding light into your images, though, can increase your creative options to the point where you can really start to experiment with abstract and different shots that make your photography really eye-catching. So I'm going to be adding a lot of artificial light to my images to give me more creative options and also improve my settings. More light means better settings, more depth of field, less camera shake, and less grain. So I'll be doing that by using the Adaptalux Studio macro lighting system, a system specifically designed for macro photography. This is the control pod, which has all of the batteries and control for your lights. And into the control pod, we can plug flexible lighting arms, which have LED lights at the end of them. We can bend these around into all sorts of positions and place our light exactly where it needs to be in our images. Now, because this is designed specifically for macro photography, it makes a fantastic tool for experimenting with tiny little subjects like our peppercorns today. So check out how much light we now have down on our little pile of peppercorns here, all coming from this single flexible lighting arm from the Adaptalux Studio, which is actually sat above our shooting area on a mini tripod. We're getting a lot of light down onto those peppercorns, which is really improving our settings. So we've managed to reduce our ISO just a little bit, but I put most of that extra power into our aperture, which has gone from f1.8 to f11. That's given us a huge amount of extra depth of field in our shot, and it's looking a lot sharper, a lot nicer, and overall a lot more interesting to the eye. As you might have guessed, introducing a single light into this shot is not all that we can do with our lighting. The Control Pod 3 actually supports up to 5 different lighting arms, and we have all sorts of different and interesting colors. So we can plug in colored LEDs to introduce more vibrancy to our images, and we can also add color filters to the ends of our lighting arms. They just magnetically attach, and then we can add even more color and soft diffusion into our images to make the lighting in our shots much more pleasing and much more eye-catching. I'm going to be playing around with all sorts of different colors and lighting arms from different directions as I go along. That is the joy of LED lighting like this. So when I was talking about it being quite daunting to figure out how you want your lighting, this is the ideal solution for making that process a little bit easier. With LED continuous lighting like this, you can see the results on the back of your camera as you're playing around with your lighting and changing things in your shot. That makes changing your settings a lot easier, changing your composition much more fluid, and generally experimenting around with different colors, different lighting styles, much more simple because you can see everything on the back of the camera as you're making your changes. Now I'm going to find a nice little setup for these peppercorns, probably get a few different compositions, and then we can talk about something a little bit more advanced to finish off our shots of the peppercorns. So before we take a look at how I've done my lighting, we need to talk about these little red sparks showing up on the back of my image. These are from my camera. So if you've got a modern camera like mine, this is a Sony a7 III, a lot of them have a setting called focus peaking. And when you're doing macro photography like this, focusing manually, you will want to have a clear indication of where in your image you are focused. That's what these little red marks do. So if I change the focal point in my image, you'll see that those little flecks of red come and go. They'll move through the image. I want to be focused right on the front of those two peppercorns just there, and I can clearly see that that's where I am. There's other ways to do this, of course, just being good with your eyesight and seeing where in your image you're in focus can work just as well, but having nice little technological hacks like that can really help to change the game when you're trying to focus. Now, taking a look at the lighting, you'll see that it's changed in this image, and what I've done here is used a single white lighting arm coming around to the right hand side of my black peppercorns with a blue color filter attached there. That's giving one side of the peppercorns a nice little blue color, and then I've got an amber lighting arm twisted all the way around the back, coming from the other direction to give the back of the peppercorns a little glowing orange haze. This makes everything look a lot more interesting. Considering those black peppercorns were fairly plain at the beginning, it's a really nice way to add a bit of color and a little bit more interest into your images without too much editing. Those of you that have watched lots of our macro photography tutorials before will probably know what my last tip is going to be for improving your macro photography at home, and that is focus stacking. We hinted at it earlier on when I was talking about my macro focusing rail, and it is a fairly advanced technique, but it's well worth giving it a go because the improvement to your macro photography is quite vast. All the way through this shoot, you'll probably have noticed the depth of field on my images. It's quite shallow and not a lot of my image is in focus at once, but with focus stacking, we can start to combat that. Focus stacking is a technique that is going to use all of our setup here in tandem to create an image that is perfectly in focus, or as close to it as we can practically get. The biggest piece of technology here that we're going to use is actually this fairly innocuous looking slider. It's got two different dials which can move the camera both side to side and front to back. We're mostly interested in the front to back movement because focus stacking involves moving the camera through your image. As the focus moves through the shot, you're going to be taking photographs so that we can stack them together in a piece of software which will take only the sharpest pieces of each image and put them all together to create one sharp shot. So the tripod is going to be really important because we don't want to move our shot as we move our camera forward. The shutter release cable is going to be really important so that we don't shake the camera into a different composition. And of course, our lighting is giving us a nice, interesting shot, but also a wider depth of field in the first place so that we need to take fewer shots as we go. Now that's a very brief explanation of how focus stacking works, but I will link up in the top right hand corner of your screen to a full video that explains that full process and the Helicon software that we use to stack everything together. Now I know that sounds like a lot, especially if you're a beginner, but I promise you the results are worth it. As you can see from those images, looking back at the first ones we were taking handheld, zoomed out, we've got a lot more color, we've got a lot less camera shake. Everything has been improved drastically just with a few tips. And I realize I've run through this really quickly, but I do encourage you to go and take a look at some of our other macro photography tutorials. I go through most of these tips in various different ways with lots of different subjects on our channel. So go and take a look, see if the subject that you're shooting has been covered by our previous videos. For those of you that watch these videos all of the time, I'm sorry if I've repeated myself, but it's nice to have all of these straightforward tips all in one place. Now, I've really enjoyed taking some shots of my peppercorns today. I'm going to take a few more and play around with this probably for a few hours and see what I can get. For now though, that is all that I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.